we'll go ahead and jump in here. The topic we were going to talk about is the U.S.-Israel relationship. So there's a few things that I want to start with. So I guess I want to start with actually a quote and then a couple of quick videos, and I'll tell you why, and you'll see why in a second. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Okay, I'm going to go back to the start. Here we go. Okay. Um, First, a great quote from a former ambassador to Israel. His name was Samuel Lewis. As you see, he was ambassador for about 8 years. He says the relationship with Israel is deeper and wider than government to government. It is unique among all our relationships in the world. It exists like a Catholic marriage of old. You can love each other, yell at each other, disagree with each other, even leave each other for a period of time, but you do not get a divorce. So I just think it's so it really does sum up what we're going to be talking about over the next hour here. Just want to be able to see that's what I want. And so I want to start with that. Now, there's two videos. We were going to do this a couple weeks ago, so it was right after the big rally in DC. So I just want to show a couple of videos that I took from there that you're going to see, which have a lot to unpack in the 2 minutes we're going to watch them. So let's go ahead and watch them and see what they have to say, and then we'll unpack it together. So let's go to the next slide here. Here's the first video.
Tens of thousands of people are gathering in Washington in a show of solidarity with Israel. Joining us live now from DC is CNN reporter Gabe Cohen. Gabe, good to have you with us this morning. So huge crowds there.
Thumbs up, you guys can hear?
We go from here. We must stand with Israel.
Yeah, huge crowds. And organizers had said they believed this would be the largest gathering of American Jewish communities in recent history. Tens of thousands of people, a huge sea of people are packed into this section of the National Mall, about a mile long, all fenced off at this point, largely because of security concerns, given how contentious this conflict has become here in the United States in recent weeks. Now, what you're seeing behind me is a very strong bipartisan showing of support between Democrats and Republicans. The new House Speaker here in the U.S., Republican Mike Johnson, standing beside his Democratic counterpart, Hakeem Jeffries, as well as Democratic Senator Chuck Schumer and Republican Senator Joni Ernst. So all of them standing with Israel. And that's really the purpose of this event, to say three things. One, that supporters here stand in solidarity with Israel and Israelis, that they stand against anti-Semitism and the rise in incidents we've seen in recent weeks here in the U.S. and across the world, and also the fight to get Israeli hostages still in Gaza released. These speeches expected to continue for the next hour or so, and we believe we're going to hear very soon from some of the family members of hostages still in Gaza today.
Okay, Gabe Cohen, CNN's Gabe Cohen, coming to us live from a very loud Washington, D.C. Thank you, Gabe.
Okay, that's the first one.
Tens of thousands of people.
Let's watch the second one here.
We are here united, Democrat and Republican, House and Senate.
But the survival of the state of Israel and her people unites us together, and it unites all Americans.
We stand with Israel. We stand with Israel.
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack right there. Stop share for a second. That's first of all, was anyone at that rally? I'm just curious if anyone went to the rally. If you did, raise your hand. If not, then that's or right in the
Shana
chat.
was there.
Oh,
Shana
great.
was at school, yeah.
Amazing.
And a lot of her camp friends were there.
Yeah, great. I mean, and I know we had a lot of HSI alum that were there as well. It's in and of itself, it's pretty amazing. Let's zoom out and look at this picture. You're talking about bipartisan leadership on Capitol Hill. What can you get Republicans and Democrats to agree on for anything? I don't know, but they were both there as leadership. Chuck Schumer's chant was a little bit awkward. He's going to have to work on that a little bit, but nonetheless, it was very nice. And nearly 300,000 people gathered on the National Mall, which is really remarkable when you consider the following story, which takes place 80 years ago. And I'm going to go, even though we're talking about the U.S.'s relationship here, I'm actually going to step back a little bit even before there was a state of Israel, because in order to understand the relationship, we have to understand what's going on a little bit before as well. So I'm going to share again here. I want you to see, there's a story here. On October 6, 1943, you had over 400 rabbis that traveled to Washington, D.C. They brought a petition with over 1 million signatures on it to come to Washington, D.C. and to bring to the president, President Roosevelt. And this petition said, please intervene in order to save Jews in Europe. By this time, you already know what's going on. They already knew about mass murder, and the Jewish community was asking them to intervene. And this was part of a much larger PR campaign. We're talking about tens of thousands of people gathering in Madison Square Garden, full-page ads being taken out all across the country. And then you have this delegation of rabbis that comes to Washington or to meet with Roosevelt. Now, they don't get a meeting with Roosevelt, which is shocking because 3 months earlier, FDR had met with Jan Karski, who was this like Polish resistance person who managed to smuggle out a report of what was going on. And he basically published this huge report about like the extermination of the Jews that was going on. And he met with a bunch of world leaders, and he sat in Roosevelt's office and gave him this report and talked about it as well. So Roosevelt knew what was going on, and they couldn't get a meeting. The Jews couldn't get a meeting with him. And the schedule wouldn't let them meet him. And they said he's busy. It turns out his whole afternoon was free, and he snuck out the back in order to go. Now they couldn't get the U.S. to do anything at this particular at this meeting, and they totally failed in this respect, which is amazing when you consider now 88 years later the scenes that I just showed you. Now, it wasn't that FDR was necessarily anti-Semitic. Okay. I want to show you a couple, but he was certainly a politician. And I want to show you a couple of public opinion polls from the time or that were done. So, interestingly enough, you have this poll, which is in 1945. Okay, and it says, "Do you favor or oppose the idea of establishing Jewish state in Palestine?" This is asking Americans. 59% favor it. Okay, 19% oppose. 22% have no idea. Right, but this is really a kicker. This is amazing. Do you think the Jews have too much power and influence in this country? 57% of Americans say yes, which is pretty shocking. Now, just to let you know, okay, at the time, okay, by the way, today, if you look at the same, they actually asked the same question, and the polls are too far, said 20% said they think the Jews have too much power and influence in the country. So we're talking about if FDR is a man of his time, okay, maybe he was influenced by the opinion at the time. But look at this also. In 1943, when this meeting was taking place, you had 7 Jewish members of Congress. Okay, that was 1% of Congress. The Jewish population in America, 3.7%. So they weren't even fully represented in the U.S. Congress. They were underrepresented, as opposed to today, when you look at the numbers today, and you're talking about 10 senators, which is 10% of the Senate, 27 representatives, which is 6% of the House. So it's about 7% of Congress is Jewish. And what percentage of the U.S. is Jewish today? Less than 2%. So we're even overrepresented today. So it's interesting when you look at this, like he was really like kind of like a man of his times here. Now, juxtapose the images the story I just told you about 400 rabbis going to Washington, which couldn't help get access to the seat of power, the president, and to today, the images I showed you start. But also I want to juxtapose 2 other things that happened a little bit earlier. Number one, in 1985, you had operations going on in order to save Ethiopian Jewry. And one of the operations that's going to happen is called Operation Joshua. Operation Joshua, the background of this is that the Israelis started an operation called Operation Moses in order to save Ethiopian Jews. by having them trek into Sudan, and they got them out of Sudan. The Israelis then blew it because they leaked the story of what was going on. The rulers of Sudan at the time were not necessarily friends with the Israelis, partially because they were influenced by the Arab League, and if word got out that they were helping Israel and working with Israel, even though they didn't have diplomatic relations, they're kind of going to become persona non grata within the Arab world, within the Muslim world as well. And word leaked out they were helping, so they stopped the operation. Now, that's where Operation Joshua comes in. And what happens is that you have two senators, one named Alan Cranston, the other one, Alfonso Del Mato, who got all 100 senators to send a letter to President Reagan in order to have him intervene and pressure Sudan in order to resume airlifts and save the Jews that were there. So Vice President George H.W. Bush then goes to Sudan, personally meets with the dictator, this guy named Numeri, and ultimately does pressure them, makes the arrangements. However, one of the stipulations that the Israelis can't be involved in all. So you're talking about that you had American C-130 Hercules cargo planes that flew into Sudan, airlifted out about 500 Jews, and then brought them into Israel and saved them. And it was only U.S. involvement. The Israelis were not involved. And what was in this for America? I mean, they were going out into this African country to save Jews. There was no real policy thing that was good for them, but they did it anyway. And on top of that, a few years later, when that same George H.W. Bush was president, he is going to intervene in order to save more Jews in what's called Operation Solomon, where in a 36-hour period, the Israelis were able to airlift out over 14,000 Ethiopian Jews, and Bush and the Americans were intimately involved because Ethiopia was going through a civil war at the time, and Bush sent this senator that you see pictured here, Rudy Boschwitz, by the way, who was a Jew, who happened to be born in 1933 in Germany, and his family fled. And 50 years later, he is going to end up being the guy heading up the negotiations to negotiate a ceasefire in Ethiopia so that 14,325 Jews could be saved. So how do we get from the images of those failed rabbis to America saving Jews, even though it doesn't necessarily benefit them at all? And what we saw recently, or what's going on right now in Israel, where you have U.S. warships in the Red Sea that are shooting down missiles being fired at Israel from Yemen. It's a pretty amazing turnaround. So we really have to ask the question, what changed? Number two, what I want to ask today is, why does a special relationship between the U.S. exist? What are the historical and the practical reasons? And number three is, what are some of the examples? So before we go into that, just two quick quotes, because it doesn't matter if Democrats, Republican, they both have this. Number one, former President George W. Bush. You can read it. The alliance between our governments is unbreakable. Yet the source of our friendship runs deeper than any treaty. It is grounded in the shared spirit of our people, the bonds of the book, the ties of the soul. When William Bradford stepped off the Mayflower in 1620, he quoted the words of Jeremiah. Come, let us declare in Zion the word of God. The founders of my country saw a new promised land and bestowed upon their towns names like Bethlehem and New Canaan. By the way, I was looking it up. There are over 500 towns across America that are named after places within Israel. It's quite amazing. And in time, many Americans became passionate advocates for a Jewish state. Israel's population may be just 7 million, but when you confront terror and evil, you are 307 million strong, as the United States of America stands with you. It's a pretty powerful statement. You can say, okay, one party, that's the Republican Party. What about the Democratic Party? Look at Joe Biden. For 70, this is what he said after the October 7th attacks. For 75 years, Israel has stood as the ultimate guarantor of security of Jewish people around the world, so the atrocities of the past can never happen again. And let there be no doubt, the United States has Israel's back. We'll make sure the Jewish and democratic state of Israel can defend itself today, tomorrow, as we always have. It is as simple as that. Now, these are not just words, because it's really amazing of the leader of the free world, of the most powerful country in the entire world, that is saying, we stand shoulder to shoulder with Israel. But as you could see from the beginning, it wasn't always so. So what I really want to understand first is talk about, what are the reasons that this relationship exists? Why do Joe Biden and George Bush and the leaders of the Senate and both the Republican and Democrat get up there and make such strong statements about Israel? So for that, let's go back in time. I want to show you a document from 1945. Okay, this is from a week after Harry Truman becomes president. Okay, and listen to what it says. Now, April 18th, 1945. Is there a Jewish state yet? No. Okay, well, this is what he says. But is Zionism alive and well? For sure. Now, listen to what it says. It is very likely that efforts will be made by some of the Zionist leaders to obtain from you, he's talking to Truman, at an early date some commitments in favor of a Zionist program, which is pressing for unlimited Jewish immigration to Palestine and the establishment there of a Jewish state. Question of Palestine is, however, a highly complex one and involves questions which go far beyond the plight of the Jews of Europe. If this question shall come up, therefore, for you in the form of a request to make a public statement on the matter, I believe you would probably want to call for full and detailed information on the subject before taking any particular position. Right. So basically, this is the State Department and potential advisors to the president, Truman, saying that you don't really know anything, and the Zionists are going to be coming to you and want you to say that they should have a state in Israel, and you need to just consult us before you make any rash decisions, is basically what they're saying. Now, if we go to March, we skip to 3 years, and we go to March 1948, okay? The independence war in Israel is already going on. But in March, they still haven't declared a state, and the war is not going well for the Jews. And the U.S. is going to threaten to pull support for the partition plan and endorse a British trusteeship over Palestine, which basically means all that stuff that happened on November 29th, which we just celebrated about a week ago, 1 week ago, where the UN voted that there would be a Jewish state in Palestine, that was about to be null and void. Because if the U.S. pulls out backing, that's it. And so the U.S. community, Jewish community, decides to mobilize, and they send Chaim Weizmann, who is sick at this time, going to the U.S. to try to meet with Truman. But Truman won't give him a meeting. Again, it's like reflections from 5 years earlier when Roosevelt wouldn't meet with him. Weizmann can't get a meeting. The State Department and others are pushing the U.S. to back the British, and they tell Truman not to recognize a Jewish state if it's declared. And George Marshall, Secretary of State, says, "I'm going to resign if you recognize a Jewish state." So what ends up happening? This statement: 11 minutes after Israel declares independence, the representative of the United States at the UN gets up and reads this following statement that Truman sent him. This government has been informed that a Jewish state has been proclaimed in Palestine, and recognition has been requested by the provisional government thereof. The United States recognizes a provisional government as a de facto authority of the new state of Israel. By the way, Marshall didn't resign. It was a bluff. But nonetheless, how did we get there? How did Truman decide, okay, against all these odds, I am going to declare a state? There's a guy named Eddie Jacobson, and there's a great little video I want you to watch about this. So watch this. This is his daughter who is recounting all of this happening. It's Eddie Jacobson's daughter who's telling the story. It's a phenomenal video.
My father was Eddie Jacobson. Although his name was Edward, no one ever called him that. He was Eddie to everyone. He was best known as being Harry Truman's partner and lifelong best friend. Daddy grew up in this Orthodox family. His parents were immigrants. Daddy was not well educated. He had to leave school at a very, very early age to help support the Jacobson family. Daddy went to work for a haberdashery store in Kansas City and went almost every day at noon to take the little packet of money to the bank. And the bank teller was a man by the name of Harry Truman. And this is where they met and became friends. The two men just clicked. They were brothers. Total respect for each other. They decided they would go into business together. And they started Truman Jacobson in the prime location directly across the street from the Hotel Muehlbach.
This man with whom I was in business was Eddie Jacobson. He was one of the best buyers that ever I came across. And I was one of the best salesmen that he ever had to be associated with. One of the finest men I ever had anything to do with.
And all of a sudden, the bottom fell out. They had to declare bankruptcy. They remained very, very, very close friends always. Truman went into politics, as you know. Daddy traveled all of Kansas and western Missouri selling shirts and pajamas. When he was in town, they always had lunch together. They always enjoyed each other. I always called him Uncle Harry. Members of the organized Jewish community used to go to Truman. They knew what was going on. They wanted help. You have to see Dr. Chaim Weizmann when he comes to the States. And Truman said, I don't have to do anything. I'm President of the United States.
I gave orders that nobody was to come to see me and talk about the Palestine affair.
Frank Goldman, who was international president of B'nai B'rith, called one night, middle of the night, and said to Daddy, you've just got to go and talk to Truman. The situation is dire. So in the middle of the night, Daddy went down, got on an airplane, went to Washington, walked in to the office of Matt Conley. Matt was Truman's appointment secretary, and said, does the boss have any time to talk to me for a little while? And Matt said, yes, but Eddie, don't talk to him about Palestine.
Dr. Weizmann had been trying to get in all along, and I wouldn't let him in. But someone did come to see me, and he got in. His name was Eddie Jacobson. He came in, he stood around, didn't say very much, was as quiet as he could be. And I finally said, Eddie, what in the world's the matter with you? Have you at last come to get something? Well, because you never have asked me for anything since I've been in the White House and since we've been friends. And then he told me that he thought that I ought not to keep Dr. Weizmann out of the White House.
And then Daddy said, Dr. Chaim Weizmann has come to the United States to tell you about the situation in Palestine, and you won't see him. Harry, that's not like you. All he wants to do is talk to you. And about that time, Harry's chair turned around and he looked out at the rose garden, and pretty soon Daddy said he could see him drumming on his desk. And Daddy said to himself, I got him. And he pulled the chair around and said, okay, you bald-headed son of a bitch, I'll see him.
Dr. Weizmann is a wonderful man, one of the wisest people I think I ever met. He was a leader, one of the kind that you read about and seldom see. We had a long, long conversation, and he explained the situation from his viewpoint, and I listened to him very carefully. On my desk at the White House, I used to keep a quotation from Mark Twain, which said, always do right. This will gratify some people and astonish the rest.
was his habit, the president's final decision gratified a nation and astonished the world.
The United States recognizes the provisional government as the de facto authority of the new state of Israel.
After the recognition and the State of Israel came into being, Daddy's role became even more important because there was no ambassador yet. Every bit of business that was done between Israel and the United States came through Eddie Jacobson. It came through our living room. It is important to speak truth to power. It is important to maintain your friendships. Daddy was in the hospital for a short period of time, and I went to call on him, and I stood next to his bed, and he said, "You know, I spend all this money going to and from Washington with all of this business I have to transact there for the new little state. I won't have anything to leave you." And I said, "Daddy, you're leaving me the best thing of all. This is quite a heritage I have."
So a couple of things I want to take from that. Number one is at the time when the Jews in Israel were learning to wield the sword, the Jews in America were learning to wield political power and how to walk the halls of Congress and how to get involved in the American political system. Right? Again, look at the numbers that I showed you before. 1% of Congress in 1943 was Jewish. Today, about 7% of Congress. And that's just a piece of it, right? It's just a piece of it. But these things have to happen in order for things to change. But we see this back in 1948, and for Truman, it was the personal relationship he had with Eddie Jacobson that gave him the access. But that wasn't all. But that wasn't all, because Truman later says, he says, actually, when he was speaking to a group in the 1950s, he said to them, he said, "I'm Cyrus." Basically, he saw himself as kind of like the Cyrus the Great, who was enabling the Jews to go back to their promised land. He very much saw it as a religious thing as well. There's another piece. Truman was also much of a politician, and one of his advisors, Clark Clifford, said that if you think about it, 1948, that's an election year. And Truman needed the Jewish vote in New York. And one of the ways to get the Jewish vote in New York was to recognize the state of Israel. So when I first read this, I was a little bit skeptical, because I said, well, wait a second, everyone talks about the Jewish vote. But the truth is that Jews make up 2% of the population. And even back in 1945 or 1948, you're talking about less than 4% of the population. That's not really a huge voting bloc. And then I looked at the numbers for New York. Did you know that in 1948, that the Jewish population of New York was 25%, which is insane. And I was like, okay, that makes sense. You need the Jewish vote in New York. Now it makes sense there. So you have other factors that were leading to it as well. But we should say the rest is history, right? Wrong. Because the U.S.'s relationship, if you remember Samuel Lewis's first opening words for us, is that it's got its ups and downs, but it's never going to be annulled. Well, after the tremendous high of U.S. being the first country to recognize Israel, 11 minutes after it declared independence, you still had an arms embargo. Okay, and then fast forward another 8 years to 1956, you have the Suez Crisis. If you see the map that I have on this timeline, circled in red, you'll see that those are the Straits of Tiran. And what's going to happen is that Nasser, who you see in the bottom picture with Eisenhower, okay, who is the head of Egypt, he closes the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping. right? You can see that there's that if you were at a lot and you want to get out to the Red Sea, you have to go through the Straits of Tiran. He closes them. He nationalizes the Suez Canal, which also is going to tick off the British and the French as well. And so the British, the French, and the Israelis decide we're going to go in together. We're going to conquer the Sinai. We're going to open up the Suez Canal. So they go in on this. They launch this campaign, but the U.S. pressures them to stop. It actually pressures the British and the French out of the deal. The Israelis still go in. They take the Sinai, what we call the Sinai campaign, and they only give it back when the international community agrees that the Egyptians are not allowed to close the Straits of Tiran anymore, and the international community will guarantee that they don't get closed. But the U.S. is actually backing Nasser through all this. And why is this happening? Because they are very much in a post World War II lining up Cold War. Right? Secretary of State John Foster Dulles said he strongly expressed the view that we had gone as far as possible to try to make it easy for the Israelis to withdraw. To go further would surely jeopardize the entire Western influence in the Middle East, and the nations of the region would conclude the United States policy toward the area was, in the last analysis, controlled by Jewish influence in the United States. In such event, the only hope of the Arab countries would be found in a firm association with the Soviet Union, meaning that he thought that backing the Israelis was going to drive the Arabs closer to the Soviets. And says if we distance ourselves from the Israelis and we pressure them on this, then we can keep the Arab countries over in the West. Now, the problem is that when Eisenhower does this policy, it doesn't work. Nonetheless, the Arabs still go under the Soviet bloc, influenced by them. And he actually admits it later on that it didn't work, but that was the policy at the time. That was the calculations. And in fact, Eisenhower wanted to put sanctions on Israel for taking over the Sinai. Now, in the end, the sanctions got blocked because Lyndon Johnson, who happened to be the Senate majority leader at the time, and William Nolan, the minority leader, both opposed it. And they said the Senate would not approve economic sanctions against Israel. And this highlights a huge piece of the U.S.'s relationship that I want you to understand. It's not just president. Even when we talk about the political aspect, Congress has a huge say in it. The president we see is the most vocal. The president is the most, is supposed to do foreign policy, but there's so much with the U.S.'s relationship that is relied on Congress. Easy one to tell you. Congress has the power of the purse. So any money that's going, foreign aid, that's going through Congress. Okay. Congress also acts as like a way of bringing up issues for presidents to deal with. The easiest example I have is Iran. Okay. The first time that the administration really focused on sanctioning Iran in a like really meaningful way happened when they passed the Iran-Libya Sanctions Act back in 1995, and that was brought up by Congress. I mean, President Clinton signed it in the end, but he was not looking to do that. It's the Congress that led the charge there. So Congress is going to be really, really important when it comes to the U.S.-Israel relationship here. Now, in 1967, we'll continue with the timeline that you see in front of you. Everything is going to change with the 1967 Six-Day War. Because before Israel, most of what they got, the supplies they got, the military supplies, were not from the United States. It was from France, actually. But prior to 1967, the U.S. didn't really take them so serious because they didn't really see them as a big player. But after 1967, they thought, wow, these guys could really be a check against the Soviets. Okay, and I'll just go to show you one thing here. If you look at American support, public opinion, American support for Israel, right? March 1948, okay, before Israel was established, the poll was, would your sympathies lay with the Arabs or the Jews in Palestine? Jews 28%, Arabs 11%, neither is 44%. 10 years later, 1955, 1955, around the time of the Suez Crisis, right? A little before, they asked the same question. Do you see, or was it important for the U.S. to cooperate closer with Israel? Fairly important, 30%. Very important, 34%. Okay, still not huge, but from the 1960s to today, Americans have consistently sympathized more with Israel. And that's what this chart is that you see here. If you're looking at this, the lowest numbers you get are of sympathizing with Israel back in like in the 70s. You get down, by the way, to like 30 something percent. But you never have the Arabs getting anywhere near where the Israeli side of thing is. And up to where you get up into, by the way, 10 years ago, 61% for the Israelis and 12% with the Arabs here. So really one of the turning points is going to be in 1967. If we go, right from here, okay, where it's just going to go up and up and up, okay, where you have the support for Israel. But a lot of that is not because of any like shared values type thing, I guess you could say it has to do with Cold War and the idea of balancing against the Soviets. Now, what happens towards the end when the Cold War is nearly over? So one of the things I want to show you here, back to the timeline, you see there's two interesting events going to happen. One in 1981. So Reagan is the president at the time. Israel is actually going to launch an operation to destroy the nuclear reactor that Iraq is building. Okay. And they went at this alone, and they got criticized. Reagan, publicly and privately, is going to criticize Israel for bombing the reactor. Now, fast forward 10 years to the Gulf War, and some of the people were involved in the Reagan administration, like Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld, are actually going to send a big thank you note to Israel that Iraq didn't have nuclear weapons. But 10 years earlier, no one foresaw that. The other thing I want to point out to you is in 1982, when you had the first Lebanon War. Now, this is the first war of Israel's that is going to be kind of like controversial in the foreign world meaning not Israel. Actually is going to be controversial in Israel as well later on, but for other reasons. Again, Reagan is going to publicly and privately criticize Israel. Now, why am I mentioning this? Because the destruction of the reactor is going to happen in July of 1981. The first Lebanon War is going to happen already in the middle of 1982. Between those two events, in November of 1981, Israel and the United States are going to sign what's called the Strategic Cooperation Agreement, which is basically going to codify the U.S.-Israel relationship. And we're talking about, it has everything from military cooperation, intelligence sharing, to economic cooperation and scientific cooperation across the board. And I bring that up because even though the president is publicly and privately criticizing Israel, both before and after this thing, that never nullifies the agreement. They still sign it, and they never stop using it, even after the first Lebanon War. So it shows you a number of things. Number one is the relationship is so strong that even though they disagree here on these things, but they're not going to break it off. And number two, it's not all about the president, because a lot of this agreement also had to do with the military and Congress and other non-governmental bodies. So that's a couple of things I want to point out to you there. What else? Today, it's not going to be as much about the Cold War. And there's this great quote I want to read you from Michael Oren, who was one of the Israeli ambassadors to Israel. He actually he wrote a book about his time in office there called Ally. By the way, he also has written a couple of other incredible books if you want to check them out. One of them is basically the book on the 6 Day War called 6 Days of War. And he also wrote one about the U.S. as a relationship, or I should say, not really, Americans' involvement in the Middle East since 1776. So if you really want some good, dense reading that's fascinating, you should check his stuff out. But listen to this. He says, Herm Shalansky of the USS Truman, Jewish skipper, showed me the ship's chapel containing Torah scrolls confiscated by the Nazis for their extinct Jewish People Museum. Nearby, the exhibit about Harry Truman recalled how the president ignored advice of his counselors who opposed Zionism. 11 minutes after Israel's creation, right, he recognized Jewish state. Skip. Though separated by 7,000 miles of sea, the United States and Israel were intrinsically linked, defending the same values. We confronted similar threats from Soviet communism to Saddam Hussein to jihadist terror. Of course, the interests of no two countries can ever be entirely confluent, especially not those of a superpower and a tiny Middle Eastern state. But then again, no two countries had more in common spiritually, ideologically, and strategically. And the fact that Americans and Israelis were willing to fight for their ideals placed us in a slimmer category yet, even among Western nations. I saw the uniqueness of the relationship aboard the USS Truman. I saw it in the sailors from the rural towns and inner cities who gathered for a Holocaust memorial ceremony below decks. It's amazing. You're talking about Holocaust ceremony on an American aircraft carrier, and heard the earnest questions they asked me about life in Israel. They listened raptly to my lecture about the history of America in the Middle East and about the legacy of American support for Jewish statehood. Anti-Semitism indeed plagued my youth, and anti-Israel agitation later confronted me on American campuses. I forgot none of that, but neither could I undervalue the warmth and admiration that the overwhelming majority of Americans, including the Truman's crew, held for Israel. When we looked at one another, those sailors and I, we saw a familiar reflection. I thought to myself, Brits, covenants. They thought, ally. So I thought it was a very nice description of what is today, because today it's not necessarily about the Cold War, but you still have this relationship, right? Here's another example from Alexander Haig, the Stanford Secretary of State. Israel's the largest, most battle-tested, and cost-effective U.S. aircraft carrier that cannot be sunk, does not carry even one U.S. soldier, and is located in a most critical region for U.S. national security. Right? Israel and the United States share common enemies, and they are Israel's the only democracy in the Middle East, and Israel and America feels they can count on it. And some of the stuff that we see today, for example, even that under these agreements have been signed, the U.S. actually has a huge store of munitions that they keep in Israel, right, in case that's needed in the region. And for times like the war that we're going through now, the United States allows Israel to tap into those stores of munitions and to use them and then replenish them after the war. And this is the second time we were able to do that. So that's part of this relationship that's going on. What I want to show you next. Yes. Now I want to go into some of the other like specifics about what this relationship looks like. So there are different levels. There's government and political, right? So we've talked a lot about that. Israel gets $3.8 billion every year for military finance grants, which is basically foreign aid. It's part of a 10-year deal they signed under Obama. And all of this is basically what it is that military aid. So if Israel gets like a shopping list, say, okay, I want 3 F-35s, I want a bunch of Bradley fighting vehicles, whatever it is, that's how they get it. You get missile defense cooperation, Arrow missile the Arrow and the Iron Dome we know so much about. A lot of that's produced by manufacturers within the United States, by the way. It was Israeli technology developed, factories and stuff in America. Okay, this is part of the relationship. Cybersecurity, drones, all this stuff is because of these memorandums of understandings. Combating PTSD. Israel and America work together to have programs dealing with how to deal with PTSD, which is pretty amazing. They have joint military exercises they do. I'll show you a picture here, right? Not here, here. For example, the one on the right, picture you see on the right here, in this past year, largest ever joint exercise held by Israel and U.S. military. You're talking about thousands of soldiers that are all branches of the military that are participating. This one actually has to do with combating threats associated with Iran, which is quite relevant at the time. Okay, but this is the type of stuff that's going on. What else? Economic. Listen to these numbers. In 1972 already, Israel is they're going to create a couple of different organizations. One is called the um, Binational Science Foundation, and they also have the Binational Agricultural Research and Development Fund. Just to give you some numbers, in 50 years, the Binational Science Foundation, okay, has given out over $700 million in grants to 5,500 different projects for scientific research going on. Okay, the Agricultural Research and Development Fund has been in operation for over 40 years already. So some of this, there's also another organization that actually is also a part of the JNF's network called the International Arid Lands Cooperation, and they deal with like how do you deal with like water and agriculture in arid lands like that are deserty, things like that. And so, for example, Israel has signed memorandums of understanding with California to help them develop their water system. I think they built one of the desalination plants. The largest desalination plant that you have in California was built by Israelis. So this is some of the other ways that they're cooperating together. What else did I want to show you? Oh, yes. There's a special bandage that was developed with one of these grants, by the way. You see it pictured here. It's like a first responder bandage where like they carry in the field and they can put this bandage on and it kind of like works to like stop bleeding. There was for example, was used. There was a time when there was a former member of Congress from Arizona, Gabby Giffords. I don't know if you guys remember this. She was shot in this parking lot, and they actually applied this bandage, which saved her life. Which is just an example. By the way, you have different visits of Americans come to Israel, Israel coming to America, not just tourism, but first responders, firefighters, police officers, medics, doctors. They all many of them, their missions coming to Israel for joint trainings that they do. And Israel is sending people to help America. So, for example, natural disasters, Hurricane Katrina, Surfside. Israel had teams on the ground actually helping with search and rescue during both of those, which is pretty amazing. When we talk about tourism, this is interesting numbers. Since last year, you had almost 900,000 tourists from the United States coming and visiting Israel. Makes up a significant number of our tourism. The 2 years that you see in the bottom, that was from Corona. We haven't quite recovered from pre-Corona numbers, but that's a lot of Americans coming to Israel. Okay, so there's a lot of different ways that the U.S.-Israel relationship manifests itself. Study abroad is part of the U.S.-Israel relationship. Okay, people coming to study over here and vice versa. Now, another interesting fact, I put this here, I forgot to talk about it. Israel's the only country in the world that has a memorial to the victims of 9/11 that's anywhere outside of America. The only one. What else do I want to say? Okay, so where does all this lead us? Which leads us back to one of the questions about what really is U.S. relationship. How did some of those things that we talked about earlier happen? The backstory is personal relationships. Okay, we talked about Eddie Jacobson and Harry Truman. Why did Harry Truman recognize Israel? Because of his personal relationship with Eddie Jacobson. That's what gave us access. By the way, the other thing I didn't mention is that George H.W. Bush, who was so involved with the rescuing the Ethiopian Jews, why did he care so much? Why was he so involved? Because of a guy named Gordy Zacks. Anyone ever heard of Gordy Zacks? Gordy Zacks was a very good friend of George H.W. Bush, and he's the one that's basically whispering in his ear, "We need to do something. We need to help them." And just to understand the nature of the personal relationship here, this is a statement that the Bushes sent to the family when Gordy Zacks passed away. Barbara and I were deeply saddened to learn that our dear friend Gordy Zacks has passed away. We were saddened because he was one of my staunchest and earliest political supporters. Right? So okay, they got to know each other in politics. We're both a trusted and respected advisor on our critically important relationship with the state of Israel. I leaned on Gordy frequently and valued his advice. But most of all, we are saddened because Gordon Zacks was our friend, with a heart as big as the Buckette State, right? So it goes back to the idea that it's the personal relationships that ultimately gave people access. Yes, we learned to wield political power. We learned to to walk the halls of Congress, but it all goes back to the fact that business partners talked about these issues. They became friends, right? Um, and that's one of the things I really want to highlight. Why do I want to highlight that now? Because talk about what changed between 1943 and 2023. That we developed relationships with and ran for offices ourselves and developed relationships with those who were in office. Okay. But there's one more thing, and that is let's talk about the near future. Let's talk about what's going on now. This was a very interesting poll that came out that I want to show you guys. Just see how people are chat. Okay. They did a survey just since the October 7th attacks about views on Israel. And still, most Americans have a favorable view of Israel, except in one demographic. And that's what I've circled in red. Ages 18 to 29, 56% have an unfavorable view of Israel. But there's another place. They did in the same polls, they asked that are the attacks of Hamas genocidal? And are they justified? And people said, yes, they're genocidal. And yes, they're justified. And so look, you see what this person does. I just keep staring at these numbers. The slim majority of 18 to 24-year-olds Americans say Hamas slaughtering civilians can be justified by the grievance of Palestinians. Then 62% of the exact same group agree the massacre was genocidal. Genocidal, justified. So I leave with this. So we're going to finish up with this. What does this say about the future of the U.S.'s relationship? Are we in bad hands? And my take on it is I don't think the battle has been lost. That I believe that when you look at the demographic of 18 to 29-year-olds who answer it this way, you're talking about a demographic that still can be very much swayed and different impressions made. You're talking about mostly people who probably don't know so much, and with having conversations with their friends, conversations with people who are Israel's friends, then they can be changed and they can be swayed. And I just look at Congress. If you look at the last two classes, freshman classes going into Congress, they include a lot of people in the younger generations. You're talking about they weren't, most of them are under 30, just one person in Congress under 30. But you're still talking about plenty of people under 40. And you look at by and large the voting records on the US's relationship, still very strong. Okay. And that's because people in the Jewish community, the pro-Israel community, take the time out to get to know these people and get involved with them politically and get involved with them personally and help educate them on the issue. And what I would say is that every generation we have to refight this battle. No battle stays won, no point stays proven. Yes, right now, most Americans are going to sympathize with Israel, but they do that because we talk about it. It's not just an inherent, innate thing. They have to be taught about it. And so what I want to say, especially in this time now, is give you guys support over in America. I'd say don't be afraid to talk about Israel and the U.S.'s relationship. You can't be. You have to be proud of it. We can't say, look at what's going on and say, I have no words. Because Israel's detractors have plenty of words. Right? That we have to speak the truth even when it seems that no one's listening. And we need to support each other on this because you look at the rally in Washington that we started with. 300,000 people, right? You're not alone for wanting a strong U.S. relationship. And we just have to talk about it and why it's important, because most Americans still think it's important. And I think the people who don't are the people who are in the minority. Now, by the way, there's one other thing that I need to finish up with here. Can I finish this here? This is the last one. And that is, I didn't tell you the whole story of the rabbis. I need to go back to that. 400 rabbis go to Washington, D.C. in 1943, and they can't get a meeting with the president. They fail, right? Well, it's not so simple, because they didn't give up, and they continued to launch publicity campaigns. And by the way, the campaigns ultimately worked, because the pictures came out of this delegation of rabbis being snubbed by the administration. And it actually looked bad for the administration. And ultimately, it's their visit that is going to lead to the establishment, with some other things happening as well, of the War Refugee Board, which was credited with saving about 200,000 Jewish lives in Europe. It was an American government board that was designed in order to try to save Jews, and it did. That wouldn't have happened without these rabbis going and continuing to state their case, continuing to talk about it, even though they were rejected that one time. So they actually did make an impact by just having the power of speaking up. And the last thing I'll say, and then I'll open up if anyone has any questions. There was a former member of Congress named Tom Lantos from California. I don't know if anyone remembers him. He was a Holocaust survivor from the same town as Elie Wiesel, actually. And he had a quote that I once heard from him. And he said, he's passed away for like 10 years now, but he had a quote that I liked that I think is very, very relevant for the times we're in right now. He says the following. He says that the veneer civilization is paper thin, and we are its defenders. So the U.S.'s relationship is strong, but those of us in America still have to continue to talk about it and the importance of it, and maintain our relationships, as the daughter of Eddie Jacobson said, because you never know when we're going to need those people.